I'm going to talk about the suffragists, a group of women, teachers, artists, nurses, housewives, librarians, women from every walk of life, every race, every religion, every class, who over 7 decades and 3 generations worked together to win the most fundamental right of American democracy, the vote, which had been denied to women by the US Constitution until then. So the story I want to tell is really a story about democracy. And it's about it really cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who has a voice in our government? Who gets to participate? When we say we the people, do we really and truly mean everyone? And of course, we're asking those questions right now. And this election will be making some of those decisions right now. So the fight for women's suffrage is really one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. And it was again, 7-decade struggle, and it encompassed 3 generations of activists. And I realized that the reason I wrote this book was I realized that as a politically aware and politically engaged American woman, I had no idea how it was that I had obtained the right to vote, because I knew it wasn't in the Constitution to begin with. And I knew at some point I had acquired that right. When I turned, actually, I was on that cusp of 21 and 18. And I didn't know. And I asked some of my friends, very well-educated, well-read women and men, and I said, do you know how American women got the right to vote? And they would look at me blankly and sort of say, oh yeah, Seneca Falls. And I realized that, in fact, we didn't know this story, that it has not been taught very much or very deeply. Sometimes there's a class in college that may have dealt with it, and that's great, but there aren't too many. We certainly don't learn about it very much in high school. And if you look at the texts for American history text, a survey text, you'll see the American women's suffrage movement dispatched, shall we say, in usually a sentence or a short paragraph. And usually it says something like, in 1848, American women demanded the right to vote at the Seneca Falls Women's Suffrage meeting. And then in 1920, they were given the vote. I can tell you, that is not how it happened. American women were not given the vote. They were not granted the vote. They had to fight for it, tooth and nail, over 7 decades. And it required, again, 3 generations and over 900 state, local, and national campaigns for women to finally receive, I don't want to use that passive, to win the right to vote. That active verb is important. As one suffrage historian says on that tremendous documentary that PBS is airing again this month, called The Vote, a 4-hour documentary, which is the best treatment I've ever seen of the entire movement. And one historian says, women weren't given the vote, we took it. And that is a more accurate phrasing of how it happened. So this fuzzy idea of how women won the vote, it's usually portrayed in sepia tones and women in gorgeous outfits and white dresses and fabulous hats, and everything looks very sedate and pretty, but it wasn't. It was a vicious fight, and women sacrificed a great deal to be able to win this right of democracy. And the 19th Amendment, which did codify women's right to vote in the Constitution, was not just a constitutional change. It was not just a electoral change, or it didn't just make women full citizens for the very first time. It actually was a cultural change. It signified a societal shift in the roles and the rights of women. And you may realize that the end of the suffrage movement, of the women's suffrage movement, coincides with the beginning of the Margaret Sanger's birth control crusade. And so it's not a coincidence that these things are happening simultaneously. So the 19th Amendment signifies the largest expansion of democracy and of enfranchisement in our history. And it was done peacefully. It was done from the grassroots up, and it's a great template for how change can be made. So this whole story is about how change can be made in a democracy. And so my book takes place primarily in the summer of 1920, when the 19th Amendment is on the cusp of ratification. It will give the vote to all women in every state, in every election for the very first time. And 35 states by the summer of 1920, so a century ago, 35 states had ratified, but 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states in the Union at the time, were required for full ratification. And it turned out that Tennessee could be the 36th state. Luckily, Illinois had already ratified the 19th Amendment. My state of Maryland had rejected it. So it gives you a sense that this was not a unanimous decision of the nation. If the Tennessee legislature approved the 19th Amendment, it would become the law of the land just in time for the fall 1920 presidential election, which was a pivotal election when the nation was making decisions about how the direction of the nation was going to take in the 20th century. Coming out of World War I, was it going to be a leader of the free world, or was it going to just become isolationist? Immigration was a big issue in 1920. There were racial tensions, there were uprisings and violent clashes in many American cities in 1919 and 1920. There were labor strikes. There was a lot of labor unrest because of wages and working conditions, very much like our situation today. So America was making big decisions, and American women wanted to be part of that decision-making process. They wanted the vote. So if the Tennessee legislature approved, women would get the vote. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, the suffragists realized that it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not enacted in their lifetime. Now, again, we're on the third generation of suffragists. The women who started the movement were gone, and the women who were poised to take it over the finish line weren't born when it began. So the fear that this might derail the last phase of getting the 19th Amendment into the Constitution was real. And when we realized that what the suffragists saw was that the nation was swinging in a more conservative direction. It was becoming more conservative. And in fact, the 1920s were very conservative politically. We think of the flappers and all kinds of great dancers and dances and things like that. Actually, it was very conservative politically. And the suffragists realized that their window of opportunity was closing, that if they were not able to get it through now, it really might not happen. And I think their fears were well-founded. Those of us who've lived through the ups and downs of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced into Congress by some of these same suffragists in 1923. It was intended to be the 20th Amendment. And as we know, it is still not fully ratified 97 years later. So I think they were right to be worried. Now, by 1920, they'd been fighting for over 7 decades since that first outrageous demand was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls women's rights meeting. Now, this was not the first time women had talked about obtaining the right to vote or about women's rights. Now, women's rights was something of an oxymoron at that time. Women had very few rights, very few legal rights. For instance, a woman had no custody over her children. The father had complete custodial rights. If she left the marriage, she left her children. She had no property rights. Anything she owned, inheritance, her own wages, her own property, became the property of her husband if she married. A woman could not bring civil suit in her own name. She could not testify in a court of law. She could not serve on a jury. So women could never be judged by a jury of their peers. And she could not vote. She could not enter most colleges or universities. Most professions were closed to her. The clergy was closed to her for the most part. There were some denominations that did allow women. I believe the Unitarian Universalists did. But the window, the world of a woman in the mid-19th century when this movement begins is very circumscribed. And women are purposefully not supposed to move out of what was called domestic sphere, the home, being a wife and a mother. That was all she was supposed to be. And the society was structured so she could not leave that very easily. And even what she had to wear, those 10 pounds of clothes from neck to her feet, corsets, petticoats, all of that was to make it hard for her to move, was to restrict her. And so this idea of women's rights was really radical. And the most radical of the demands that Elizabeth Cady Stanton made at Seneca Falls was what she called Resolution Number 9. And I encourage you to look at this. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments. It's based upon the Declaration of Independence. It's a brilliant, modern list, a litany of the things that are wrong with American government and American society in its treatment of women. And some of those issues are still on the table, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton talks about equal pay for equal work in 1848. So again, it's a very modern document. But the most controversial aspect of her demands was the right to vote, the franchise. It was considered so radical that even her friends and fellow reformers and abolitionists who were at this meeting in Seneca Falls told her to take it off the agenda. They begged her, take it off. It'll make us seem ridiculous. It's too far out. And it's an interesting idea of what is radical and how radical ideas eventually enter the mainstream. We should remember that. But it was a young man who was in the audience in the Wesley Chapel that afternoon. And he had ridden his buggy 50 miles to attend the meeting. And he stood up and he said, no, you must demand the vote and you must be willing to fight for it. And it was a young Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. And he stood up and he said, the vote will never be given to you as women and never be given to me as a Black man unless we are willing to fight for it. And he convinces the other very reluctant participants in this women's rights meeting to accept this resolution, resolution number 9, demanding the right to vote. And I truly believe that if it wasn't for Frederick Douglass doing that, we would never hear about Seneca Falls. And Douglass truly believes in universal suffrage. He calls himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life. And he truly, truly is. He attends almost every women's rights convention for the next 50 years until literally the day he dies. He dies just hours after attending such a meeting in Washington, D.C. And he believes in the idea of universal suffrage. And one thing we have to realize is that he did not show up at Seneca Falls by accident. He wasn't just passing through. He had been invited because he had worked with Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott and Lucy Stone. He had worked with the foremothers of the abolition movement and Susan Anthony, though Susan Anthony is not at Seneca Falls. He had worked with them in the abolition movement. They began their political awakening in abolition, in the idea of freeing the slaves. And that was their main political activity. And out of that comes the idea of women's rights. If all humans have the divine spark and have the right of freedom and should not be in bondage and should be free and should have a voice in their community, should have the vote. And so the women's rights and women's suffrage movement actually grows out of the abolition movement. And you have many of the same characters involved in that. And it's a fascinating, they're almost sibling causes through the Civil War. And then there's a heartbreaking split when the powers that be tell Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Stanton that no, the nation can't handle 2 big reforms at once. Only one of you will be given the vote. Only Black men, not Black women, and not white women. And that causes, we see this all the time, that the powers that be will pit 2 disenfranchised classes against one another. And it's purposefully so. And they do that. And so there is a rift because the women feel betrayed. Frederick Douglass pleads with them and says, he's horrified. Sojourner Truth is horrified by this. But he says, Black men need to vote for their very lives because there is great Reconstruction era violence against Black men. And he promises the women that the woman's hour will come. I promise you. I will work for it. And he does. He makes good on that promise. That's where the title of my book comes from, The Woman's Hour. But it is not here yet. You will have to wait. And the suffragists are very angry about this. And there is a rift over the 15th Amendment, which gives Black men the right to vote, but no women. And they refuse to support that. And race will become a vexing issue in the suffrage movement, both within the movement, because there certainly is racism within the movement, because it's a very segregated society. But also, even more so, the anti-suffragists will use race as a weapon to defeat the idea of women's suffrage and certainly to defeat the idea of the 19th Amendment. Now, in the years since Seneca Falls, tens of thousands, really millions of women had waged over 900 battles to win the right to vote. They'd traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony said, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation, because they had to change hearts and minds about women's role in society before they could hope to change the laws. And that's something that all of you as activists, as defenders of women's rights know has to be done. You have to change attitudes before you can hope to change laws. These women, to put it mildly, were the original She Persisted. And I'm going to show you a few photographs. See if I can figure this out. I'm going to share my screen, I hope. Hold on one second. I think I can do this. Well, I'm not sure I can. Okay, we will carry on without it. So I can't see where I can share the screen. It doesn't seem to have that. Okay. So they travel hundreds of thousands of miles. And we see them at first in horse and buggy. And then by the end of the movement, they're in automobiles. And it was a stupendous feat of organization. When you think of it, they didn't have any of the travel or communication tools that we take for granted today. When the movement began, passenger train travel was in its infancy. There's no transcontinental railroad. The telegraph has just been invented. There's no typewriter. There's no telephone. Everything's being done by hand and by foot and in person. I had to read a lot of handwritten notes, which is actually great for a historian because you can see what people are thinking by the way they write it, by the way they underline it, and capitalizations and exclamation points, give you an insight into how they're feeling when they write that. Even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio was not in use yet. And as one young editorial assistant in my publishing house came into my editor's office, she had read the manuscript when I'd handed it in, and she came to my editor and said, "Wow, I don't know how these women organized all this without Facebook." And my editor kind of laughed. And of course they did organize all around the country without Facebook. They held meetings, they held rallies, and they marched, which was not considered proper for women to do. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their white dresses with yellow sashes. And so when we see those marvelous pictures of thousands of women marching through the streets of our major cities in early 20th century, they're wearing white. And when you see the women in Congress wearing white at the State of the Union, when you see Nancy Pelosi wearing white at important moments in Congress, when you see Geraldine Ferraro wear white when she accepts the vice presidency nomination, and Hillary Clinton when she accepts the presidential nomination, they are wearing white, and that is in honor of the suffragists. Now, we have to understand that it was not easy to march in those parades. It was not like today, oh yeah, I think I'll go participate in that women's march. Women suffragists endured contempt and ridicule in their communities, in their churches, in their clubs, even in their own families, and certainly in the press. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists. Yeah, those words were used. Bad wives and mothers, and Bolsheviks and socialists and communists. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed. They were too loud, too smart, too confrontational. All the things that are often said about strong women leaders today. And the men who supported suffrage were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. So clearly, they were frightening to a large segment of the American population. And in their quest for equal citizenship, the suffrage movement employed a wide variety of stratagems and tactics. And many of those, marches, demonstrations, picketing, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and legal test cases to the Supreme Court would be adopted by the civil rights campaigns to come later in the 20th and in the 21st century. The suffragists were ingenious and they were fearless. To test the prohibitions against women voting, Susan Anthony and Sojourner Truth and about 150 other women actually voted in the 1872 presidential election. Susan Anthony was soon arrested, tried, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. She went around New York State where she was being tried, giving a series of lectures entitled, "Is it a crime for a US citizen to vote?" And of course, we're asking that question again today too. Failure of this voting experiment in 1872 led to Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment, which would supersede all the state prohibitions against women voting. And then as now, it's in our Constitution, it's part of our federalist system, that the states are in charge of voting requirements and election procedures. That's why we have such a mishmash of different voting rules in the country, and it's a problem, as we know. So they drafted this amendment. It was based upon the wording of the 15th Amendment, which had given the vote to Black men. And it was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. Every year, the suffragists would go up to Capitol Hill and testify on its behalf in committee, and every year it would be thrown back into a file cabinet. The amendment was voted down in committee or on the floor of the House and Senate 28 times. So meanwhile, the suffragists worked in the states, including in Illinois, where there was a very vigorous suffrage organization and many attempts to try to get the state to allow women to vote. That is finally successful in, I believe in 1917, and Illinois women do get the right to vote by a referendum, where of course only men can vote to decide whether women should be given the privilege of voting. And it took a long, long time, and there were many, many defeats along the way in Illinois and in other states. Meanwhile, the amendment is stalled in Congress, and frustration began to build. As any of us know, in a long-term movement, there will be frustration. And what happens in many social reform movements is that there'll be a split. There'll be a disagreement on tactics, not on goals, but on tactics. We see this in the labor movement, in the abolition movement, in the temperance movement, in the civil rights movement later in the century, where there'll be a group that is impatient and wants to try something new. And this happened in the suffrage movement. The third generation emerges. They are tired of pleading and begging for the vote. And they say, we are going to be more confrontational. We are going to demand it. We are not going to be ladylike. We're going to be confrontational. We're going to be disruptive. We are going to break the law if necessary. And a young Quaker woman from New York named Alice Paul leads them in a breakaway organization called the Women's Party. And the Women's Party begins doing things around 1916 and 17 that had never been done before, including picketing the White House, never been done, demonstrating in Lafayette Park, just where we saw demonstrators back in June demonstrating. Again, police came and arrested them. just as they did in June. It was quite a moment for me to realize this was happening in the same space. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists were arrested over the next year, year and a half, as they picketed the White House peacefully, destroying no property, just exercising their First Amendment rights. They were arrested on bogus charges, like obstructing the sidewalk or lighting a match after sunset. That was another one. They served time in jail, in decrepit cells. And there was vermin, there was lice. They were physically assaulted. They were clubbed. They were tied to the wall. They were physically abused. They were not allowed to speak or read or write. They communicated by singing because that was not specifically prohibited. And when they refused to eat, they were force-fed. Tubes rammed down their noses. When they were released, they toured the country in something called the Prison Special. It was this magnificent PR exploit where they rented a Pullman railroad car, and 28 of them, from 30-year-olds to grandmothers, toured the US, stopping at every major city on a northern route and coming back on a southern route. And they held marches and rallies. They were dressed in recreations of their prison outfits. And they confronted Americans and said, we are your mothers, we are your sisters and your daughters and your wives, and we have been arrested and tortured in prison for asking for the right to vote. And this begins to shake people up even more. And finally, after World War I, when women served their nation in ways that they'd never been either asked or allowed to do before, and I actually wrote a book about that called Fruits of Victory, and a lot of it does take place in Illinois, where women took over the fields, but they're in the mines, and they're in the munition factories, and they're in they're building airplanes and tanks, and they're doing men's work. And the idea of women being too fragile, too emotionally unstable, too weak to handle the rigors of political thought and voting kind of melt away and sounds silly at this point. And finally, in June of 1919, the 19th Amendment won the approval of Congress very narrowly by 1 or 2 votes in each house. And it's sent to the states for ratification. And I think you should be proud to know that Illinois was the first state to ratify. A year later, in the summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory or possibly defeat as it arrived in Tennessee, because Tennessee was a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for women's right to vote. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the amendment, all with the same rationale, states' rights, and they did not want Black women to be able to vote. And the 19th Amendment does give the vote to Black women too. The suffragists knew they faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. And this was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gather in Nashville, and it gets pretty wild. There are powerful forces working against women's suffrage, political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reasons for opposing the amendment, including politicians who are nervous about this unpredictable new large voting bloc. 27 million women will be eligible if the 19th Amendment is ratified, and no one knows how they will vote. Clergymen who believe that women voting goes against their interpretation of the will of God, who supposedly made Adam to be dominant over Eve, and to question that questions the Bible, and they use the Bible to rail against this amendment and women's right to vote. Corporations who believe that women would be bad for business. And for example, the textile manufacturers are out in force trying to defeat the 19th Amendment. Why? Because they're afraid if women, if mothers can vote, they will want to abolish child labor. And these textile manufacturers were dependent upon cheap child labor and cheap labor of women. And they didn't want women being able to have any say in policy. And the liquor lobby. Of course, women had been very involved in the temperance movement, in the WCTU, which is, as we know, was headquartered in Evanston. And women were involved in that, some for moral reasons, but for many it was a domestic violence issue. Because again, women had no rights to press civil suit. There are, very draconian divorce laws, if there were any. And that meant that women had few choices if she was in an abusive relationship. And so the idea of cutting off liquor at its source was a very attractive one. It was really one of self-defense. And the liquor lobby, even though prohibition is in effect in 1920, they are hoping that if they can keep women away from the polls, maybe those prohibition laws will not be so stringently enforced. And the liquor lobby is really there in Nashville, including sponsoring a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel that was dubbed the Jack Daniel's Suite for Tennessee's favorite bourbon. And there they ply legislators with booze 24/7 and try to convince them to vote against the amendment. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women would be organized to defeat a law that would give their sisters the vote was really shocking to me when I first encountered it in my research, but maybe it shouldn't be. We can't expect all women to agree. We certainly know that. It was still a bit of a jolt. Some of these antis, as they're called, anti-suffragists, were very well-educated women. And some of them, like muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell, was an anti-suffragist, one of the most famous journalists of her time. And even Eleanor Roosevelt, I know that always brings gasps, was not a suffragist. She was not an anti-suffragist, but she was not a suffragist. She never supported the movement. And in fact, when New York women get the right to vote by referendum in 1917, she refuses to vote in 1918. Now, what we'll see is a very swift evolution after the 19th Amendment is finally ratified, and she will join the League of Women Voters and become a protege of Carrie Chapman Catt, its founder and the great suffrage leader, who's sort of the main character in my book. And we will see her political reawakening. And it's really quite an astounding evolution of her thought. Now, many of these anti-women were social and religious conservatives who feared that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. It would, in their opinion, endanger the American home and bring about what they called the moral collapse of the nation. And we hear those rationales today. Certainly we hear them when it comes to a woman's right to choose. They warned that the idea of women's suffrage, the idea of women having any sort of equality with men would alter private life, not just political life. And that's what made it so dangerous and, in their mind, and so complicated and so passionate. It really, it's a reminder that the debate over women's suffrage was never just a political argument. It was also a social and cultural and moral debate about the role and the rights of women in society. It's a precursor to what we call the culture wars today. And of course, we know we are still in the midst of that struggle. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings and fistfights, and the newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. The outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you, but it comes down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. I'll let you read about that. Now, all this took place a century ago, exactly now. But I think you'll find this story is one that has surprising and even unnerving modern themes. It helps explain where we've been, but also where we are today. It deals with topics that are in our headlines right now: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy. And heaven knows we're going to hear a lot about that the next few weeks. And racism, which of course is always with us, because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is waved in defiance. And we know we hear echoes of all of that right now. Now, I submitted the manuscript for this book on the day before Election Day 2016. I pushed that send button and it went out to my editors, and they wrote back, "Great timing. We thought this was going to be coming out in the first term of the first woman president." Well, it didn't turn out that way. But in the intervening few years, the themes of this book have actually become relevant in a way I could not have anticipated. And it's had layers of meaning I could not have known it would. It's a story of ordinary women, grassroots activists taking to the streets and demanding change. It assumes new relevance and resonance as our citizens have taken to the streets to demand justice and equality. It's a tale of women standing up and demanding their voices be heard. And of course, this came just before the Me Too movement gained some traction. This is a history of citizens fighting for their rights at a time when rights we have assumed were secure: voting rights, citizenship rights, press freedom, women's rights appear to be endangered once again. There are important lessons, I think, that we can learn from the fight for women's suffrage. It's not just a colorful history. It teaches us that social change is slow and political change is hard, but it is possible. And the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It was not over. It was not won in 1920, and it is not complete today. The 19th Amendment did give the vote legally, constitutionally, to all eligible women, but what we know is that it would be undermined and subverted by racist Jim Crow laws in the southern states, which would deny Black women the right to vote for another 4.5 decades. And for Asian American and Native American women who were not considered citizens in 1920, that fight would also go on for decades. And as we know, until the Voting Rights Act, which gave some enforcement teeth to the 19th Amendment and to the 15th Amendment, that those protection enforcement provisions have been gutted by a Supreme Court decision in 2013, and we see an alarming proliferation of terrible voter repression and restrictions coming out of the states. So it's another lesson that a law is only as good as its enforcement. It also teaches us that the reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is both an inspiring and a cautionary tale. It's complicated, it's messy, and there are moral compromises made to achieve success that make us wince today. I hope this story will teach a new generation of activists that protest is patriotic and necessary, but it must be followed up by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just picket and march and demonstrate. They also debated and lobbied and campaigned and drafted legislation. And they did not rest when the 19th Amendment was secure. Carrie Chapman Catt, as we know, founded the League of Women Voters, which is celebrating its centennial this year too. And I'm a proud member of the Baltimore City League. And Alice Paul went on to draft the Equal Rights Amendment, the next step in women's rights. And of course, we know that is not yet secured. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And today it's our role, it's our responsibility to protect the vote for all citizens. And speaking on another important cause to you and to me, to protect women's right to control and decide for her own best interests, her own be in control of her body and of her mind. So today we also should not allow cynical disruption of voting processes, or to be told that voting rights is a partisan issue. It is not. It is the stress test of our democracy. And we are failing that stress test right now. I hope we will be able to have free, fair, and well-regulated elections in a few weeks. I know the League will be there defending democracy and making it work as it has for a century now. I think it's our responsibility to continue the work of the suffragists for voting rights and for women. And that's the legacy that I think this story brings for us today. So thanks very much, and I'd love to answer some questions.
Oh boy, did we need this today. Thank you. We only have a moment for questions. Thank you so much. I almost stopped recording things because I was so inspired. This is just because so many of our audience is in Illinois, I was just wondering, because it was sort of an fascinating little thing in your book, what happened at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair with Buffalo Bill, and how he recognized Susan B. Anthony. I don't mean to give away the punchline, but maybe you can relay that really briefly.
Yes, it's a wonderful anecdote where at the Columbian Exposition, the famous World's Fair, Buffalo Bill had his Wild West show going, and there was a controversy about whether, and he had shows on Sunday, and in fact, Susan Anthony had advocated that the fair be kept open on Sundays because that's when working people could come with their families. They worked the other days of the week, and there were, clergy and religious opposition to keeping it open on Sunday. And so a reporter asked Susan Anthony, who stayed the whole time. She was at the fair the entire season. She was quite the star. And they asked her, what did she think of these clergymen objecting to having the fair open on Sunday? She said, well, I'd rather, have my son or my child, she had no children, but I'd rather that my family be at the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show than, they learn more than in most churches on Sunday. And this didn't go over too well with many aspects of the public, but Buffalo Bill loved it. And so he wrote to her and said, please come and bring all your friends. And so she's sitting there in front, and he came charging out on his stallion and went around and the tent and to music, and then he comes right in front of her, and he and his horse bow in front of her in honor, and she waves her little hanky, and it's this great moment when you realize that she is one of the most beloved, and to some people admired women in the nation, and others hate her, truly hate her, especially in the South. She's hated.
It's such a wonderful story. Again, and I promise we will finish now. We kept you so long. I just, on a personal note, I'd like to praise Steven Spielberg for reading my mind and saying to himself, this would be a wonderful movie. Is that still in the works, and when is that happening?
Yes, it is, but I'll correct you a little bit. It was not his idea. It was Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton's idea. She read the book and she was very excited about it, and she called me and asked if I would partner with her. Yes, I would. And so we have been working on this, and yes, it is. It's moving into scripts, and of course production is closed down right now. So we're hoping sometime in the latter part of 21, maybe you'll be able to see it. It's going to depend on when things can be produced again. But yeah, it's going to be on TV. It's not a movie. It's going to be a TV kind of series. So we can tell a broader story. And yeah, it's very much still in the works. And Secretary Clinton has been just a inspiring partner on this, and believes in the story and the importance of the story for Americans today.
She has been inspiration on many things, and I apologize. I didn't realize it had more illustrious roots.
Right, exactly. Yeah, she went to Spielberg.
That's fabulous. Well, I just got a private message from someone saying, please, you can't keep us on long enough, which I also appreciate, but we have kept you on long enough. We can't thank you enough.
Let me just say one thing, please.
Of course.
I'm not going to preach to the choir and tell you to vote, because I know you will. But I hope you will also be, of course, talking to your friends, especially in Illinois, which is going to be an important state. And also not lose heart, because this is, this confirmation hearing is going to be tough on all of us. But also, just in a more, just to promote one thing is, my book has been, this summer, it came out in a young readers edition. So it's called The Woman's Hour, Our Fight to Win the Vote. And it's meant for sort of middle school and high school, lower high school. So, I can't tell you exactly 10 to 15, but it's very fungible. There are adults reading it now. It's a simplified version of the story. It doesn't have the richness of the original, but it does tell the story to young people, to inspire them to keep that passion for justice alive, that a lot of the suffragists begin when they're young girls, to see something is wrong with society. And so I want to encourage young women and young men to learn about this really glorious history of activists taking on a huge issue and eventually succeeding. So, for your young feminists and your young activists, I think it's a good read.
It's absolutely inspiring, as was this entire thing. Thank you so much, Elaine, for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's heard this for joining us today. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to your questions. There just wasn't enough time. I took away a few things like organize, educate, agitate. Mm-hmm. And I do want to end. I have no compunction about ending this way. I have 7 words. Vote, 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 vote. Everyone. Thank you all. Yep. Keep up the fight. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everyone. And do take care.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.